other part, the fourth part about attentional system, and just getting more in depth in terms of how these, let's say, systems or subsystems are contributing to attentional processing, and how we might be able to see these systems through the lens of functional imaging, and using functional imaging to be able to explore these engagements from different, let's say, brain parts, and test these hypotheses in an experimental sense with a real data, real brain data, to see if we have these engagements or not. Okay. One of the really famous models in terms of the attentional processing goes back to a really kind of key figure in the field, Dr. Posner, suggesting that probably we'll have, let's say, 3 major networks involved with attentional processing. One network is about what we call vigilance. And vigilance is about the arousal. So we discussed about that before, and it's about locus coeruleus and neuroadrenergic system. Okay, so this is what we have discussed about, how this is going to be important in terms of keeping the eyes on things that are important around us, and we call that vigilance. But for attentional processing, they believe that there is an anterior attentional processing system and a posterior attentional processing system. And in the anterior attention process system, we have cingulate cortex and supplementary motor cortex. And for posterior, there are parietal part. At the end of the day, what we are discussing about is something like the fronto, still parietal contribution to the attentional system, and how these parts are working together. Okay? But to test this hypothesis of the role of frontal part and parietal part and the anterior network and posterior network and the vigilance part, they try to develop a specific sort of FMRI paradigm to be able to test this hypothesis. And I'm going to show you the trial. Before showing you the experimental design that we have, I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the flanker paradigm or flanker task. As you can see here, the task is basically you are supposed to use your arrow key to show that the central arrow here is showing right or left. Okay, so you are supposed to tell right or left, okay? You just have the keypad in front of you. You're supposed to say it is, let's say this one is towards left, left, right, left, left. So these items, these are named as congruent. And this one is incongruent. Okay. As you can imagine, when things are incongruent, they are really harder to detect. Okay. So there is something like a conflict, and you need to resolve that conflict to be able to find and do the right answer. Okay. So they try to use this one to explore how attention and executive function is going to intertwine together, or they might be able to get separated. And it is really close to the types of games that we tried today together from the first part of the session, trying to use attention, be vigilant, and trying to monitor what is happening outside, and remaining alert to see what are the responses that you have, because you are going to receive these stimuli. And then using your executive control to sometimes control the conflict that you have. But how they have used the flanker paradigm to design their own task. Their task has different parts. There is a target part in terms of you are supposed to say, to solve a flanker question, whether this one is on the, let's say, left or right side. So that is the core of the task. But other than the core of the task, they developed another phase that is more, let's say, attentional part. So this one is more attentional. This one is, let's say, more executive. So you have an attentional part in the first place that is giving you a cue in terms of where the final stimuli is going to be presented. and most of the time the cue is valid, so they give you a valid cue. So just give you a kind of a something like a white rectangle, and you know that, okay, the target is going to be happening under the white rectangle if it is valid. Sometimes just in few occasions they give you invalid kind of cues, and you're supposed to keep your eyes over the screen, and based on the cue try to find the target, which is going to be presented to you for just 500 milliseconds. So you have a really limited amount of time, so you need to be really careful about the cues and remain alert to be able to find the target and respond. Okay, so that is the task that you are going to be presented. And for this task, as you can imagine, they have different potentials in terms of different contrast to see how different components of attention could get involved. Okay, and I highly recommend you to read the kind of the technical details about that. There is a paper by Zhu. They try to kind of show these pieces and how these pieces are working in terms of the fMRI processing. So they defined different, let's say, contrasts. For example, the alerting contrast would be no cue compared to double cue. Can you imagine why no cue compared to double cue would activate areas that are related to alerting, being alert? Anybody who has any idea, any kind of description about why when we, let's say, compare the brain state when we do not have any cue, so no cue situation. So we are still waiting for the response, but we do not have any cue, compared to double cue. Why this one should, why this contrast should be labeled as alerting? Anybody who is interested to share, just kind of turn on your audio and tell us why do you think that is going to be the alerting one? Fatima.
I think so that anticipating is the answer. It would be answered because the people are in the situation then trying to anticipate what would be happen, and based on the previous experience and or what they are trying to see, they would be see. They just anticipating and just without any cues, they are more alerting. I think so, something like this.
That is okay. Good. That makes a good sense. Make a really good sense. Let me just show you the alerting effect when you are just alert. What are the activations that we are going to see? Before going to the kind of the activations that I'm showing you, just a technical kind of issue in terms of this one is called a surface-based activation map, and this one is a volume-based. Most of the time in fMRI studies, we use one of these maps. So we use the surface-based or volume-based. In here, people, there are, I'm not quite sure about the reasons, but people use both ways in terms of both reporting the surface and volume. And there are pros and cons for each of those kind of ways of visualization to be able to show things in surface-based or volume-based. But technically, as you can see here, one of the most important things that you can see is the activation in the posterior part of the brain stem in an area which is called, what was the name of this area? Any memory about this specific part of the brain that we called, it was locus coeruleus that we discussed about before, in terms of the area that was related to, let's say, the arousal and, let's say, keeping the neuroadrenergic system active. So in the alerting part, we have the arousal and alerting part activated. Meanwhile, you have activation in, let's say, frontal eye field, in the parietal parts, in the visual part, and the visual cortex is activated because you are waiting. You're waiting for what is going to happen. And that is how these activations would be happening in terms of the visual cortex, the frontal motor areas, and the parietal parts of the brain. And meanwhile, as you can see here, you have, this is the anterior insula. You have insula as well. It's quite interesting that insula is also involved in attentional processing, and how insula is playing a role in attentional processing is going to be an interesting discussion. I'm not going to get to that right now. The other effect that you can see is the disengaging effect. Let me be back to the kind of the contrast that we have. What is disengaging? Invalid cue versus double cue. Let me show you the activations that we have. That might give you another kind of a sense about what are the major activations that we have. We basically have the activations in two parts. One is the frontal eye field, and the other is in the superior colliculus. Does it give you a kind of higher level of information in terms of what is disengaging effect? Basically, in the disengaging effect, when you have an invalid cue, your eyes is directing to one side. You are waiting for things that are happening in one side. But out of a sudden, you have the target on the other side. And if you remember, we discussed about that before in terms of why do we mean by valid and invalid. And valid means that the invalid, you get the cue on the opposite side. And that is really because you are seeing this part, and the cue is supposed to be valid because when they give you a cue in this side, the stimuli should be appearing under that side. But out of a sudden, you would have the stimuli on the other side. You need to change. You need to actively change the direction of your eyes and bringing them to the other side. And that changes in the eye direction would mean that you will have activation in. You need to have activation in superior colliculus and frontal eye field. Does it make sense? So that is the reason that we have activations in these pieces in the disengaging effect. So how that kind of these pieces are going to get involved in that activation. The other contrast is flanker conflicting effect. What do we mean by flanker conflicting effect? The flanker conflicting effect would be, which contrast? Could you just imagine, give me a contrast that would give me the conflicting effect in the brain. Which contrast is giving me the conflicting effect in the brain? That would be related to the flanker effect. If I go back to the figures that we had for the flanker task, as I told you, we have congruent paradigms and incongruent paradigm. If I compare, let's say, incongruent versus congruent, when you are presented with incongruent, then you need to resolve this kind of, let's say, incongruent. You still need to say on the right side. And that is going to be solved with your executive control. That is called the flanker effect. And the flanker effect, as Puryo has mentioned, it's not congruent versus incongruent. We should say incongruent more than congruent. So that is the sort of contrast that we are interested to see. And as you can see here, basically what you have frontal, parietal, again insular cortex involved, and many activations actually in the cerebellum because of the execution. It seems that the cerebellum is a kind of really key player in terms of the controlling issues, and you have things related to control, you have these areas. Meanwhile, as you can see here, this part, as you can see here, these parts are mainly the supplementary motor areas. And these parts are involved because of the response inhibition, the role of response inhibition, and the control that we need to exert here. Why inferior frontal gyrus should be here? I mean, should be activated here. We talked about exactly the ventrolateral prefrontal cortex. Frontopolar would be a little bit ahead. I mean, this would be frontopolar. Dorsolateral would be here. as we have the activation here. This is dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. But this part is inferior frontal gyrus or ventrolateral prefrontal cortex. I'm seeing the chat box, and that is kind of the reason that I'm kind of reading the responses from the chat box that the students are posting. And that is an important part in terms of, let's say, doing the inhibitory control, because we need to resolve a conflict. Because when all the arrows are towards one direction, you have a tendency to say that that is the direction. You need to suppress that and kind of press this direction. And that suppress would be IFG. IFG would do that suppression. So you have the IFG getting involved in that process. And then the last slide would be basically what we call an interaction of alerting by flanker conflict, which has a really sort of classic what we call frontoparietal activation. And as I'm not quite sure that it might be a little bit complex for you right now to discuss about that, I highly recommend you to see that. I probably can kind of spend a few even minutes from the next session to describe you what does it mean. I highly recommend you to kind of read that carefully in the slides. This is talking about what we call the alerting by flanker conflict. And this is a sort of interaction contrast. And interaction contrasts in fMRI are probably one of the most kind of complex type of contrasts that you might have. And here, by this specific, let's say, interaction, it means that comparing no Q in congruent situation minus no Q congruent. So it is the conflict. So I mean, we know that incongruent minus congruent would be the conflict, compared to incongruent minus congruent again, but this one is with a double Q. So we know that incongruent versus congruent, while we do not have any Q, is different to incongruent versus congruent while we have a Q, while we know that there is no Q. So when we are alert, when we are alert, and while we are alert, we are resolving a conflict. That is what we get, frontoparietal. But this one, we do not have that level of alertness, and we are resolving the conflict. So this is the resolving, the specific characteristic of resolving a conflict when you are alert. So that is a specific feature of this contrast that would give you a really classic frontoparietal activation in the kind of the map here. As you can see here, the parietal would be a little bit up and the frontal is here. So I'm not going to go to the details about that, but that is the type of kind of how when we have an fMRI task, the kind of the bottom line message from what we have been discussing for this, let's say, Posner network, attentional network task is, first of all, when you have an fMRI task, the fMRI task that I showed you before, how we might have different contrasts within one fMRI task. And the reason that we have these contrasts is basically going back to the question that I asked you from in the first part of the session today, in terms of, okay, when you have a specific attentional game, what are the different components of attention are involved? And as you felt even from the first games that we had, it is not just one single function. There are different functions in terms of, let's say, the alerting, the engagement, the finding the solution, comparing different pieces of information, engagement of working memory, and how these pieces are working together, and how we might be able to tease them apart through an fMRI task with developing different sort of contrasts through this kind of fMRI task and then see the activations and see how these activations could be different. And all of them would have a level of, let's say, frontal, parietal, but they have different characteristics as well that would show different engagement of the different processes for these different contrasts that we are discussing about. Okay, that is the end of this part of the discussion and the part of the class today.